And welcome to our live event here at Real Producers of Columbus, Understanding Through Conversation. This is going to be an open and honest conversation surrounding race and its relation pertaining to real estate. I am here today to help facilitate and keep us on track, but my main role here is to listen and to learn. Some of you that are watching, if you would like to comment on the discussion that we're having today, please feel free to do so. And our panelists will be more than likely addressing those after this conversation so we can stay fully engaged for you in the moment here. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Katie, and I'm the owner and publisher of Real Producers of Columbus. And for nearly 4 years, we've been telling the stories of the top 500 producing realtors in the Columbus and surrounding cities. We also hold quarterly events in order to build relationships and to build community. So the heart behind this publication is to bring down walls and to provide a personal look into the lives of these amazingly driven individuals and community difference makers. So the role of a real estate agent is far-reaching, and it goes beyond just helping someone to buy and sell. So a realtor helps enact change, and you all produce so many ripples within our cities. You become experts of our local businesses, and you become community advocates. So I believe as a platform, Real Producers is a voice within this community, and we have a duty to educate, given our audience and the influence that we provide. So I've consulted with my dear friend Buzz Thomas, who is on this call, in order to get an insight on this panel event and the discussion that we're going to hold today. Now, we'll be discussing a handful of topics on this call, and while we're only scratching the surface of this complicated and far-reaching topic, we do believe in the value of our time together today and the impact that this amazing group of individuals can make. So Buzz is going to be our facilitator, and we'll be touching on the following topics. We'll be talking about the overall history of racism. Each panelist is going to share a personal experience regarding racism in their lives. We're going to talk about the exclusion of people of color from the NAR. We're going to talk about the evolution of Columbus realtors regarding race, as well as the current Columbus real estate climate pertaining to race. So I'm going to introduce our panel, and then I'm going to stop talking, and Buzz, I'm going to let you take it from there. So first up, and if each of you, when I say your name, if you'll just kind of wave to us. The first panelist I'm going to talk about is Kiana Jones. Hi, Kiana. She is the president of the Realtist Association, and she's a realtor with Carlton Realty. Next, we have Newton Burris. Hi, Newton. He is the branch manager of Coldwell Banker King Thompson's New Albany Gahanna office, and he's also the principal broker for the company's 10 offices in Central Ohio. We have Vanessa Simmons. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi.
She is a wife, mom, and a realtor. She's also a branch manager for Coldwell Banker King Thompson as well. She is currently serving as a co-chair for the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for Columbus Realtors, and she is an active member of the Coldwell Banker King Thompson Diversity Council. She is also a member of the ACE Committee, which stands for African American and Caribbean Employees for Realogy, and she's also a member of the Columbus Realtist Association. Next, we have Buffy Patterson. Hi, Buffy. She is an associate broker for HER Realtors. She holds years of leadership and success, with her last corporate role serving as Senior Vice President and Director of Business Banking Operations for one of the largest banks in the country. We have Inez Williams. Hi, Inez.
Hi.
Inez is currently a realtor for Keller Williams Greater Columbus. She has been a licensed realtor for over 30 years. And during 2019, Inez served as co-chair for 2 Columbus Realty committees. One committee was the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and the other was the Affordable Housing Committee. In addition, Inez has worked in both public and private sectors in the healthcare field, serving in various leadership capacities. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in sociology and certificate in epidemiology. It's a big word. All right, last but not least, we have Norwood Buzz Thomas. Hi, Buzz.
Hey.
He is a realtor and raconteur, so that is on his card, with Coldwell Banker King Thompson. Buzz moved to the east side of Columbus around 1954, where he spent his childhood. And Buzz was one of the first realtors to be involved with nationwide children's and community development for all people's effort to improve the condition of the housing stock and to work towards the preservation of affordable housing. He is passionate about the South Side of Columbus and is working on a CE class for a historic tour of this area. He is active in his church and his community and a doting husband and grandfather. So Buzz, I'm going to turn this over to you, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it is indeed an honor to be part of this esteemed group. I know everyone here, and I have the tremendous amount of respect for the people that are on this panel. Part of this whole event came from a conversation that Katie and I had, and I was relating to her some instances, some things that had happened to me along the way. I've been licensed since 1984, and I've seen a great deal of change with respect to real estate, and some of those things that we'll talk about a little bit. One of the things that we talked about is that in 401 years, that America really hasn't had a frank and open conversation about race. We've touched on it. We've had times that we've had social upheaval, and we've had some change. I know that I've had people ask me, wasn't I pleased with progress? And my response has always been, there's been change, and when there's no need for change, then I'll see that there's progress. That's just my opinion, part of it. So I thought that we could kind of go around the panel and just get a general idea. It would be interesting to me, and I think maybe to other people, to know what it was that we learned when we were in school about the overall history of racism in this country. And as salient, as important, as crucial an issue it is, I can say for me, if I could begin, when I was in school, what I learned about color was in the history books, there were little pictures of pickaninny children that were picking cotton. There was George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington, and Ralph Bunche. And most people probably don't even know who Ralph Bunche was, but he was an envoy to the UN, which was a really big deal at the time. So for me, I will say that during my childhood, I carried sort of a sense of shame, because the only pictures we had, it's like, this is all we've done. And I know among my peers, we would have these conversations. Of course, we'd never have them outwardly in class. That was a part of it. And I think that was one of the things that stuck with me as I grow and I began to learn. So what were your what did other people have in terms of experiences in school?
So this is Buffy. I can go next. I would say if we're talking about the specific subject of racism, I can honestly say that in the typical school environment, there was no discussion of racism. In terms of history, there were figures that we've all heard, the Martin Luther Kings, the Malcolm X's, but there wasn't any specific addressing of racism. There was like, oh yeah, there was slavery, and then there was civil rights, and here we are today. And so it was whitewashed, to use the term. There wasn't really much education around the history of Black people in America. Now, I was fortunate enough when I was younger to have attended a summer program called Harambe. Both my parents are educators. And so I learned quite a bit about, our history, but in school, really nothing.
Inez?
I think likewise, very, very little in school. I learned a lot. Both my parents were from the South, so from Georgia, as a matter of fact. So I think I learned more outside of school than in school. I agree with Buffy. Nothing really at all in school. We learned that there were slaves, but the impact of that, nothing.
Yeah, this is Newton. I'll go ahead and go too. I agree. I don't know that that there was a lot of teaching other than, like Buffy said, there was a little about slavery and then civil rights. I agree with that, but there wasn't a lot of teaching. But a lot of that has to do with the people and the comfort level of whoever was teaching, because I think if you're not comfortable talking about the past and admitting that there is still racism in the world, and I would even go as far as to say a lot of the people that were teaching classes would even say that racism was over. So, I don't think there was a lot of it. One, because of the comfort level of the folks teaching the classes, as well as just um, the the limited knowledge that the people teaching had themselves. So.
This is of course. I know I'm probably one of the youngest on the panel. I'm not sure, but coming up, I went to Shaker Heights, and I guess it was kind of different for me growing up. They didn't desegregate our district until I was in the 3rd grade. So my school was pretty much 98% Black with a Black principal and all of that. And then we started getting bused. And our school, my mom went there and the school was pretty much integrated then, but we had a group called SCORE, Student Group on Race Relations. They tackled it pretty early. And we grew up having those conversations from as soon as I could remember. Rest her soul, Miss Jaffe, she just passed this year. And so coming from Shaker, we just had a different outlook and growing up with each other and being really open about having that conversation about race, to where now I'm on Facebook and seeing a lot of my classmates, they're out there and they're louder than some of us. So I had the opportunity to grow up and have those conversations, even though I grew up in a somewhat segregated city.
My experience is kind of a combination of both, because I actually, up until 6th grade, was at an all-Black school. So I had a really good foundation of Black history, a good strong foundation of who I was growing up, and, being surrounded by nurturing teachers who understood, children that looked like me. And then 6th grade happened and everything kind of changed. And that was the first time I really realized anything about the N-word, and boy, I heard it on a regular basis. It was just almost and that was their first time really, because we were it was forced busing and integration during that time. And so it was a very, I just remember growing up knowing about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and then all of a sudden 6th grade happened, and it was like, Malcolm is horrible, Martin Luther King is wonderful, and it was all from the perspective of who was teaching it. So it was really interesting, trying to blend all of that together. But yeah, so that was kind of my early experiences with education.
My experience, I think I'm glad that you touched on Malcolm and Martin Luther King. And Buzz and I kind of talked about this the other day as we were discussing this panel. I very, very whitewashed, as you said, Buffy. I remember, discussing slavery and the end of that. Martin Luther King. I don't recall Malcolm X being discussed at all. And he does, and there's a negative connotation with him in my mind, just from what I've been told or taught. So yeah, very similar. I don't have a lot of knowledge.
I would like to share this one experience. Actually, I was 7. We used to go to Georgia every summer with my aunt and uncle. My mom, my dad would stay at home and work. And I was 7. I remember I wanted to go to the store up the street, and they wouldn't let me go by myself. And I really didn't understand it. I said, why can't I go to the store? They said, because you don't know how to act when you go to that store. You don't know how to address those white people, and we're afraid for you. I was 7, so I still remember. So that caused a whole host of questions. What are you talking about? So it caused them to have a discussion with me.
Wow.
Inez, I have a similar experience because I was born and raised here, and both my parents are from Mississippi. And so, woo-wee, honey, come on back here because your mouth is going to get you in trouble.
Well, my
Absolutely.
grandmother was from Alabama, and one of the earliest experiences I had, and I can remember my grandmother's frustration. I was 4 years old, and I lived in Iowa, and I lived with her. And my grandmother lived on a street that was 1 block long, and they were the only African-American family on that street for almost 40 years. And when I was 4, one of the neighbors poisoned my dog. And my grandmother was trying to explain to me why they poisoned my dog. And the reason was that we were colored, which just didn't compute, you know, with a kid, like, but yeah, but why did they poison my dog? One of my other early experiences was my mother was a public health nurse, and I can remember I lived in Clifton Apartments. I was about 7, 8 years old, and I was so excited, and I was waiting for her to come home from work. And so she's walking up the walk with her little bag, and I told her, Mother, I found a pool that we could go to and swim. And I told her where it was, and she said, you can't swim in that pool. And I said, why? She said, because you're colored. I said, yeah, I know, Mom, we're colored, but I found this pool. And I mean, I just was so excited. And my mother kept saying, no, no. And finally, she just yelled at me and went in the house. And I thought, what did I do wrong? Now, as an adult, I can understand the frustration that she had wanting more for her children than society was willing to grant. And Katie and I had talked about this. This is really the thing that kind of precipitated this whole thing. When I was in the 5th grade, I went to Eastgate Elementary School, and it was 99% African American. And then in the 5th grade, I moved into Shepherd, and we were one of the first 4 or 5 families, African American families, to live there. The following year, there were about 20 white kids that were left, and realtors were literally going door to door saying, hey, there's a colored family just moved down the street, don't you want to sell? And so properties were dumped. And in fact, that's how we got to buy our first house, because it was so cheap. And I've always contended that I thought there was a great opportunity for someone to write a research paper and compare what took place in Shepherd Edition, where you had classic blockbusting, and what took place in Berwick. In Berwick, the attitude was, we really don't want you here, but we're not moving. And in Shepherd, it's, we're running, we're gone, and we moved to, Gahanna had a tremendous upswing in population because all the people from Shepherd moved out of there. And so you're still seeing today the vestiges of that, because the housing stock in Shepherd is a good housing stock. You're now seeing integration, reverse integration in that neighborhood that's there, but that's been since 1954. And so there's been this reservoir. In Berwick, there has been a gradual integration. Property values have maintained and increased. And I just think there's a classic study that could be done about that part that's there. So I was thinking about one other thing too, about how we were raised. And I wanted to throw this out to the group. I was always told, because once I went to Eastmore High School, and there were not many African Americans there at that time, but I was always told you had to work harder, you had to work twice as hard to get half as much. And that's kind of the lesson that I took with me in terms of interacting with white society. And I also learned, as my grandmother would tell me, your mouth is going to get you hurt, because she was, and I realize now that my parents were training us on how to interact with people, that you didn't yell, you didn't scream, you didn't draw attention to yourself. And so there were these subtle lessons. You had to work harder if you wanted half as much. So did any of you have any kind of experiences like that?
I mean,
Well,
certainly I've heard that, but I don't subscribe. I mean, I don't subscribe to that. I feel like any place that I place myself, I belong, and I don't really care what anyone else thinks about this. But
And you
I've
were,
definitely heard that before.
Yeah.
was that ever discussed in your household? Was that ever like a mantra that was there? No.
No, I mean, both my parents were educators. My mom was a dean at OSU. Yeah, not really. I mean, I've heard it definitely, but not taught.
Well, I'll say that it definitely was discussed in my family because my family is from the South as well. My parents were from Alabama and Louisiana, so they definitely, we learned at a very early age. Uh, there were certain expectations. There was a certain way that you interacted with Caucasians. There was certain things that you didn't say. And yeah, you conducted yourself differently from, than when you were around your family or other Blacks. There was definitely a difference in the interaction. And most of it was not allow them to have the relationship. It was more to keep you safe, because, as young people, you say things and you're kind of quick, because like I said, I went to a school and we were called the N-word like every other day. So it was like there was fighting, there was there's just a lot of chaos. And so our parents were always afraid that that would spill over from school into coming to the neighborhood, so it was always like, okay, you have to understand how you need to diffuse things. You have to learn to tamper down your frustration, just to be calm and be able. And I kind of learned that early on, how to diffuse situations. And I always consider myself to be a master at kind of tamping down hostile situations, because it happened a lot, so you get a lot of practice at it, so you get kind of good at diffusing.
Where'd you go to school?
Grove City High School.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
back in the days when they had a big KKK on a barn that we had to go by to get to the school. So
Wow.
yeah, we were feeling real welcome. So
Wow.
it was interesting. It was definitely
I
interesting.
feel for you in this all day.
Yeah, it was interesting. But, I mean, I think that looking back on it, you just kind of, it's a part of who you are, and you learn. I definitely learned how to interact with a variety of people. So it's something that, I carry over to this day. So it wasn't all bad.
Uh-huh. One of the things too that I thought about is one of the things I did when I was in the military is I facilitated race relations seminars, and it was during Vietnam. It was a very serious circumstance. There is so much that occurred in all of the services with respect to race and conflict. In the Navy, they dealt with it by starting this program, and we in pairs, we went from naval base to naval base, and we held these seminars. There were essentially awareness seminars. Some went okay, most were not well received. But one of the things that was discussed early on was a definition of racism. And I think sometimes that gets confused with bias and prejudice, and there are very separate things. And I think that what now we're actually saying the word racism, and what we taught in those seminars is that anything that has an ism on it carries with it the idea that there is a power to impose your will. It's one thing to be prejudiced, hey, you prejudge, I like Chevys more than Fords, or to be biased, I favor red over yellow. But when we talk about racism, we're really talking about the ability of one group to impose their will for whatever reason. And I know that I've said this many times, particularly here in Columbus, Black people have almost no choice about whether or not they interact with white people. White people can segregate themselves and not really associate with black people. There's an inequity in that regard that's there. So I wanted to ask you too that when you got in real estate, were there, and I want to come back to the history part of it, but when you got in real estate, what made you decide to get in real estate, and were you influenced by your family, and did you encounter any resistance from a racial standpoint? Vanessa, since you're on. I'm sorry.
I had to unmute. Yeah, I got in, I was probably not so much influenced by my family. I just always had a love of real estate, like probably most of us, seeing homes and that sort of thing. But I can tell you that when I got in 2005, prior to coming, I was a regional manager with AT&T. And I went natural, so because I took off a year and then I went natural, like with my hair. And right before getting into real estate, I talked to a couple of people and they're like, you don't want to wear your hair like this. You know, you might want to, straighten it and look a little more conforming. So I straightened my hair because I thought that was the best way to be more acceptable to a wide variety of people. So, so that was kind of an interesting, experience. I thought, just having people judge me, not by what I was able to do for them, but maybe because of the way I chose to wear my hair. But again, that was in 2005. Fortunately, hairstyles with Black women have evolved and society has evolved right along with it. So we have a lot more flexibility and acceptability with the way we wear our hair. So I'm back with my natural curls again. So, and I'm feeling really good about that choice. So that's kind of my early experience, and something, just so obvious that we have to contend with as Black women and how we wear our hair.
Did you know anybody of color who was in real estate before you got in real estate?
A couple of people. I did. I knew a couple of people. But to be honest with you, some of the, the high producing agents at the time that I was aware of were not people of color, so.
Yeah. Hey, Buzz, I can share, I got into real estate in 1995. And for me, it was a very kind of nerve-wracking thing to do because I didn't know anyone in real estate. My mom had a friend of hers who she worked another job, but she was a licensed real estate agent. And I did, I'll never forget the summer that I graduated from high school, I went and talked to her. And as soon as I got back, my mom said, well, you're not getting licensed, so she was adamant about me not getting into real estate and going to college. And I was adamant about getting into real estate. Obviously, she won that battle. So I went to school. And then after, is when I got into real estate. And, not knowing anybody it's an interesting place to be. And I was young. So for me, I got out of college and I went and got a job, but that was only so I could buy a house. Because literally, that's what the lender told me. They said, well, you need to be on the job. And I said, oh, I didn't know. So I went and got a job and then saved up the money and bought a house. And then I got into real estate. And to be quite honest with you, I just didn't know any better. I didn't know that, I should, like that there was an idea that you keep your job and then you work real estate until you're able to, create a living. So it was sink or swim for me. I had a mortgage, a car payment, utility bills, school loans, and I was in real estate. That's just kind of how it happened. So, getting into the business, you're right. I remember I worked for a small company first, and there was one agent there that happened to be Black as well. And when you know, when you're getting into real estate, you sort of gravitate towards whoever you're most comfortable with, right? And so, of course, I gravitated towards him, but I didn't know, you know, so I, you know, he was a person I would go to, hey, can I follow you out on an appointment? Can I, you know, and I remember, you know, I'd ask him, how long have you been in the business? I think he had been in for like 2 years before me. But what was interesting is I was talking to my manager one day and he said, well, why do you always go talk to him? I said, well, you know, I just asked him and he said, yeah. And he said, well, but he's never sold a house. And I said, well, I didn't know, you know. So, you know, so then, you know, and you know, I want to speak to this experience because I think it was very unique. But the small company, you know, I learned so much while I was there. So I was really fortunate. And before I ever came over to Coldwell Banker, which obviously was one of the best decisions I could have made, was coming over. But nevertheless, I remember the broker I had, he was a great guy. And he always encouraged people to get involved in Columbus Realtors. So, you know, you know, for those that know me, you know, I'm a rule follower. If you tell me to do something, then, you know, I'm just trying to make it work. That's what I'm doing. So I did it. You know, I got involved in Columbus Realtors, and I'll never forget Corey at Columbus Realtors. Finally, you know, I was going to meetings, I was part of the committee, and he finally asked me, he said, hey, you should chair this committee. And I said, me? And he's like, yeah. Now, once again, I'm in my 20s, you know, and I go to these meetings, and to be quite honest with you, I was so naive. You know, and it's so funny when you look back. I mean, because there just weren't very many Black people participating at the Columbus Realtors. I mean, there just wasn't. And so, you know, and then, you know, I joined this committee, and now they're asking me to chair it. So I did it. And for those of you that know, when you chair a committee, you end up going to a retreat
Yes.
for the, you know, for all the leadership and all the directors. And so you go to this retreat, and you know, that's actually like, that was the second time that I was really, really aware that I was Black in real estate. You know, so the first experience was a whole nother experience, but this experience was different because I go to this retreat, and like literally there was no Black people. You know, and so, you know, I never forget, you know, you go, you have a learning session, and then you go into, you go and they have like a happy hour, dinner, happy hour, and then everybody gets together. So we all go to this lodge, and, you know, so in this lodge, a nice fireplace, ambiance, there's certain groups of people in there. And I would venture to say that I probably was one of the younger people there. But nevertheless, you know, I'm trying to figure out, like, do I go back to my room, or do I try to, you know, and so, like I said, I did. I went, and I'll never forget, I went and sat at this table. And, you know, I tried to talk to a few people, and then I went to the table and I sat down, and I never forget, I go over there and I sit down, and obviously, like, I'm guessing I had uncomfortable written all over my face, right? And I never forget that Barbara Locke came up and sat beside me.
She's awesome.
Yeah, she came up and sat beside me, and she didn't know me from Adam. I mean, she had no idea who I was, you know, but like I said, I bet either I had uncomfortable written all over my face, or maybe she was tired of standing. I don't know. But nevertheless, she came over and she talked to me, and I tell you, it was probably one of the best experiences. And then the other person that came over and talked to me was Linda Long.
Yeah, she's awesome.
So those two people kind of, and they just happen to work for Coldwell Banker now, but nevertheless, you know, those were the two people that kind of made me feel comfortable there, you know. And so, but that was like walking in that room that day. That was one of the times that I realized, oh my gosh, you know, this is not like the most comfortable place for me. So,
Well, I can relate to that, having gone to the retreat, because I looked around the room, and I was late getting into doing board work. And I thank Rick Benjamin. He plucked me out and encouraged me. He actually put me on a committee, and he and I met for breakfast one morning, supposed to be for an hour. We were together 4 hours, and I took him on a tour of the Near East Side. And Rick was very open and said, look, I made my money up north. He said, I don't know much about this. He said, but I do know this. the Columbus Realtors is not a diverse place, and it needs to be. And he asked me, he said, will you help me make it so? So I'm thinking, man, this is fabulous that, you know, leadership is coming to do this. Because when I first got into real estate in 1984, and I described the situation as this, it's like you were married, you got a divorce, you guys had children. Your ex's family reunion is coming up and your children are asking you to come. Those people aren't going to tell you not to come, but they're not going to say, well, you're welcome here either. And so it was a very cool kind of reception that was there. And I compare that to, because I had a very similar experience. I sat at a table, I'm looking around, I don't know any of these people, except I know some of them by reputation and name, and there were some big hitters that were there. You know, I'm sitting there going, what am I doing? This boy that moved to Columbus, lived 50 yards from railroad tracks on the wrong side. And Patty Wynn Brown, I will forever be grateful to her. She reached across the table, took my hand, because I know she saw fear in my eyes, and she said, we will get through this together, Buzz. We will get through this together. And I mention that too because when Lee Iacocca wrote a book when he was at Chrysler, and there are two things that he said that people had when they moved up the corporate ladder. One was a plan on how they were going to do it, and two was a mentor. And I see that now in retrospect, and it's one of the things I think that is limiting sometimes in terms of minorities getting into real estate. There's more now than there were, but like you, Newton, when I got in the business, my first broker, his name was David Ingalls. And the way I got in, I was involved in a transaction before buyers had representation. He was the only agent. But what he did was he acted fairly. He represented the seller. But I called him up and I said, David, I don't think things are going well. And so we had breakfast together. And he was very honest with me about what I should do. As a matter of fact, he advised me not to buy this building, which I bought anyway. Okay. But then he showed me a check and he said, you ought to come to work with me. And so I got in not knowing anybody really in real estate. So anyway, did anybody else have a similar kind of, I will mention one other thing. And I throw this out. And I'd appreciate you commenting about this, because I've often said, as an African-American, as you progress in your profession, sometime or other, you are going to be the only African-American in the room. That may never happen if you're in the majority, if you're Caucasian. But as an African-American, that is an experience I think that is somewhat unique. So anybody else have any comments about those things?
I can tell you, I got into real estate. My mom's actually also a real estate broker, even to this day. Although she spent 40 years at OSU, mentioned before, she was a dean there. And I've always loved it. But I want to touch on something you said, something that you said, Buzz. So Newton, when you had that experience and you were the only person in the room, unfortunately, that still happens today.
Absolutely.
And there certainly is not enough representation within, the organization that we all belong to. There may be two of us now or three of us. Certainly, we're still underrepresented. And then I wanted to also touch on the fact that Rick Benjamin, to this day, he still reaches out to me and gives me support. He's, I don't know, I didn't know him when he was president of the board. I did have an opportunity to engage with him, but he's very supportive and continues to be to this day about, trying to push, keep going, continue to lead. And then I would say, Buzz, with regard to just an experience that I had when I was in, I was in industrial engineering, one of the places where I did that work was at UPS. And so I was in management there. And I remember one time we had like a diversity seminar. It was actually supervisor training, I think. We were at supervisor training. And I think I was one of two Black people who were in the room. And I remember the instructor, I guess we were talking about diversity on this particular day. She kept talking about Black. She kept saying Black. And so she goes, well, Buffy, what do you prefer to be called? Do you prefer to be called African American, or do you prefer to be called Black? And I said, I prefer to be called Buffy because that's my name. Right? So you just, I don't know. It's tough out here sometimes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Buzz, for the sake of kind of keeping us, because I think we could literally talk for hours. This is so good. Could we go ahead and go into everyone sharing a story of, experience regarding racism in their own lives?
Well, I'd like to share, well, I call it one of my favorite stories. It's really not about me per se, but a dear friend, a couple friends of mine, they got married. And when they got married, they were in their 30s. They didn't have children. And they moved, I don't know if, Kiana might know, but they moved to Bath. They lived in his house for a while, and they bought an hour house in Bath, which is a suburb of Akron. Mind you, they both had multiple college degrees. She was a vice principal at a junior high school. He had her husband. He had a doctorate degree in education. And actually, he was a principal in Garfield Heights, which Kiana probably is familiar with. Anyway, they bought a house in Bath. For them, modest, lovely house, but they had Mercedes. In fact, he bought her one as a wedding gift. But their neighbors called the police on them to have them investigated because, first of all, they couldn't figure out how they paid for the house. And secondly, they had those two Mercedes. They decided that they were drug dealers, drug kingpins. So, really, really, really sad. There's another incident. Actually, one of my colleagues, she works for a different real estate agency, but she shared this incident in class. This happened about 3 years ago. She works on a team, and she's the only Black person on this particular real estate team. They sell a lot up in Westerville, and her issue was when she talked to people on the phone, they were all excited. They came into the office, and once they came into the office and saw that she was Black, they wanted a different agent. Well, in that particular office, like she said, yeah, well, I did okay. I get $100,000, $200,000 houses, but my team members were getting the $500,000 houses and the $400,000 houses because the people wanted to, when they came in, they wanted to someone else. So she shared this with her team leader. Fortunately, she had a really good team leader, and she was stunned. She said, what? So she observed, she observed, and after that, she stopped that. So this is something that's happened in the past couple of years. So as a realtor, that's a whole different scenario where the type of clients you have, and to me, it has to do with racism and their subconscious belief, I think, that you're not good enough, maybe not trained well enough, just not good enough. So for her on her team, that was resolved. Her team leader, I thought, was great. She never let that happen again. So one other incident, this is personal. There's a colleague at my office, and we were talking. This is a different sort of racism. We were talking and chatting, and they asked, what are you going to do next week? And I was all excited because I was going to see, a group of us were going up to DC to spend time at the African American Museum. There's a new wonderful museum. And at the end of our discussion, when I was telling her about it, she said, why would you go to DC to spend time at that museum? And for a second, I couldn't talk. It was like, but it's a different type of racism. It's a cluelessness and ignorance that really, I think, needs to be addressed as far as racism. Like, this is a good person, but this is someone too, I think, because of that level of naivety, would say, well, I don't understand why people are protesting and rioting in the streets. Why are they saying that there's inequality? They just don't have a clue. So it's a different type of racism, I think, that requires education.
That's such a good, I'm glad that you brought that up, Inez. I can speak from experience that a lot of folks in my current circle, that is I guess the commentary that's taking place. I'm not quite sure, I don't understand, why there is such unrest right now, or that this is, in my own life, because I don't view my life in that way, or people that I meet in that way at all. I judge a person based on their character, and that's it. But, as I hear stories like what you just described, there is a true facet of the population where this is it is obviously a real issue that is still happening, that quite frankly, it is baffling to me as well. When I hear stories like that, it literally, like, it twists the heart. Like, it's heart-wrenching that people are experiencing this type of inequality in 2020. So,
and it's something, again, it's not original. Recently, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has been interviewed as far as his thoughts on racism. He's an activist. I found out recently his father was a policeman, but it was people said, what is racism? And he said, it's like, and this quote may be off a little, but he said it's like dust in the air. It's just everywhere, almost to the point where it might be choking you, but you really don't know that it's there. You don't know what's happening until you bring the sun in. Once you bring the sun in, you can see the dust. But he said, to me in a very positive way, if you continue to bring the sun in, you'll see the dust, and maybe you can clean it before it settles in, because it will always be there. So to me, it was a very hopeful statement. Racism is everywhere, but if you bring the sun in, we can address it.
Share two stories, one very short, but the first one I want to share, which is very recent, relevant, and happened to a dear friend of mine, Jerry Isham, who is a realtor down in Cincinnati. He's also a regional vice president for NARAB, and first vice president for the Ohio Realtors Association. But I don't know, and you may have heard this story a couple of years ago, only 2 years ago. He was showing houses in Cincinnati, and the neighbor called the police on him. And they were in the house showing, and when he goes and walks out of the house, the police are outside. They grab him, and mind you, he has his 9-year-old son in the car, who's supposed to be experiencing, my dad's a businessman, he is working, and I'm witnessing him work. And he comes out only to be thrown to the ground and handcuffed. And then more officers pull up with their guns drawn and stuff. And, and I talked to Jerry, and I said, and eventually the city settled. They were wrong. They let him go. They settled. But I talked to him, and I said, what changed, or what did you feel about that really upset you? And he says, what upset me is I was handcuffed, and the police, they searched my pockets, and he says, I have my business card in my pocket. They looked at his business card, and they said, anybody can make one of these. So he expected a little bit more professionalism from the police, knowing that he is a businessman conducting business and having verification there. So it kind of makes you wonder, what do I need? You have real estate agents out here talking about CCWs and stuff now, but what does that mean for a Black agent? We have to protect ourselves from a client and from the police. I showed a house the other day, and I couldn't get the alarm off. So what happens there? In those instances, we're wearing masks now, And it leads me on to the conversation of last summer, I'm going to show a house, and we're looking through the MLS at the pictures, and blatantly there's a Confederate flag in the pictures, posted up on the wall. And my clients like, you know, I don't care. I still want to see the house. They're not going to be living there. But what took it a step further to make it even more uncomfortable is that the seller was present for all the showings. So put two and two together. And the Confederate flag is there. You have a showing schedule, and now you're seeing everyone that's coming into your house to see your home. So you technically can determine who you want to give your home to. So that was a very uncomfortable situation. I have not experienced blatant racism. If they have, then maybe they said, this is some angry Black woman, and you know what, if I'm gonna talk about her, I'll wait till she leaves. Maybe that's what happened, because no one has ever come to me personally and said anything like that, but I know it's there. You know, so just the way we try to interact with the police, we think we're professionals. We are professionals. You know, we're licensed, we pay our dues, we do all of these things, but to be treated as you've done none of those things and embarrassed in front of your neighbors and stuff, I mean, that's blatant racism on so many levels. And then for the city of Cincinnati to only offer a settlement of $20,000 initially. So, you know, it's so many levels to it of people being discriminated against and racism. From when does an agent say, do you mind taking that Confederate flag down before we go do showings and pictures and things like that? When are they going to put themselves in front of that dollar to say, you know, this is what's right. I don't think we need to show this house with this. Are you afraid of offending your seller? You know, and I don't know what kind of conversations we need to have around that, because a lot of agents are more concerned about that commission check and appeasing to the seller than making sure that, you know, things are marketed property or people are comfortable and feeling that everyone is welcome.
Well, and Kiana, if I might interject for a moment, and we'll get back to, we want to hear from each of you. There's a term that, quite frankly, I've not really heard until recent conversation, and it's an uncomfortable term, and it's the term white privilege. And I want to give a real world example of that, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what that term actually means. And what you just described, if you were a white realtor, this is not something that would happen to you.
Exactly.
So simply because of the color of this realtor's skin, not even a business card was adequate. So that is an example of white privilege. Does anyone else, would they like to speak to that, or kind of on that subject and what that means?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. I want to touch on that from an institutional standpoint. In America, white is the standard. And then you refer to everyone else as some other. So if you're at a conversation, you're saying, well, there's Katie, or the woman that's over there, and then there's that Black guy that's over here. So the standard is set, and then you talk about the deviation from the standard. And that comes up in language, and people do it without even thinking about it that's there. The other thing I wanted to touch on is, I know what part of what we're doing, and part of why the reason we're here, is to help to educate people. But I'm going to throw perhaps this out as being controversial. It's not just about education, because I can tell you that everybody on this panel is educated. I can tell you that there are educated people that we deal with, and they still have bias, and they're still bigoted. And some of the most bigoted people in the world are educated. It's more than that. It's this gut feeling. It's this internal belief. And a lot of that has to do with, and I apologize, this is going to just take a little bit. We live in a 20-second soundbite world, but this is more than that. From the very beginning of this country, we have established a standard about race. We venerate the Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal, without acknowledging the caveat, as long as you were white and male. The Constitution of the United States, the ratification of the Constitution hung in the balance of the Three-Fifths Compromise, in which Black people were considered 3/5 human and 2/5 animal. And the idea was, the dispute between the North and the South is the North wanted slaves to be counted as animals, and because they were owned, and they didn't want them counted as a part of the population that would allow the South to have greater proportional representation in the legislature. The South wanted at least part of them to be considered human, so they would have greater. So anyway, that compromise, in fact, took place. So from the very beginning, that was our place that was there. So the outcome of that is this. Southern states had a disproportionate amount of representation, which gave them influence in the selection of the speaker, the vice president, and more votes in the electoral college for choosing the president. They also, once the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect, 13th Amendment was passed, slavery was over, the way that the South dealt with it is now all of those people of color count toward representation, but the systems that were put in place to disenfranchise African Americans essentially concentrated the power in the hands of a few whites who got elected over and over and over again, and so developed power in terms of chairmanships of important committees. They controlled the budget. They controlled which legislation was passed. They controlled patronage projects. And so what you had then is this block of what was then known as Southern Democrats that were also able to block any federal legislation that had to do with curbing violence against people of color. You have this really long timeline of slavery from 1619 up until after the Civil War. You have Reconstruction, you have Jim Crow, and just really recently, if you looked at that timeline from 1619 to 2020, you have a very small window of federal legislation with respect to fair housing or equal opportunity there. So all of those attitudes have been carried along. So that idea of white privilege, yes. And I'll give you one other short example. Ohio State was founded in 1870. In 1912 was the first graduated state income tax in Ohio. So for the next 50 or so years, Black people paid taxes to send white people to Ohio State University, a place that they had limited, if any, access to up until really an open policy in the 60s. So all of that time, Black people are paying for white people to get college degrees, to be their bosses, to have a higher standard of living, to have better health care, to live in different neighborhoods, to acquire amounts of wealth, such that it is not surprising that there's a wealth gap. So while, and I know this is, I hear this from white people, I don't discriminate, and I believe that, then why has this come up? Because your parents and your grandparents, and whether you like it or not, you are still the beneficiary of that head start. It's like having an elephant and a groundhog in a race, and the elephant's got a 400-year advantage that's there. So when people talk about this frustration, I can tell you this, and I should speak for everybody, but in this case, I can tell you, each one of us can tell you a dozen or 2 dozen or 100 different instances where we have faced discrimination, either from a language or actual, in my case, my office was in Arlington for a while, and I'd have phone duty, and I'd talk to people on the phone, and they'd walk in the office, and they'd say, "We're here to see Buzz Thomas." And I'd say, "Great, how can I help you?" They say, "Well, here to see Buzz Thomas." I said, "Okay, how can I help you?" And then they look at my name tag, and they go, and so you get this. But there are just multiple instances of that. So I say that because historically, I think it's important to understand that the institutions that are in place and have been in place are institutions that give one white privilege. So as you mentioned that. Anyway,
Thank you, Buzz.
yeah.
Thank you. Who would like to share next? Thank
I
you so much.
can. And so Buzz, similarly, my name is Buffy. And so you can imagine, and my maiden name was McGee. So I was often, they expected to see a little redheaded Irish girl when I would show up, but no, it would be me. So I'm very familiar with that. Even down to my college roommates, when I arrived, they were like, "Oh, I thought you were going to be this little redheaded Irish girl, and you were going to steal our boyfriends." And I said, "Well, I'm not redheaded or Irish, but I will steal
Yes.
anyway." So I've had two things actually happen fairly recently. One was within the last couple of weeks. I have some clients who are looking at homes in the $600,000 to $700,000 range, and I had scheduled, we've scheduled multiple showings. We've been looking for a couple of weeks, but on this one particular home, when we arrived, the agent was present. And so it was a little odd, but we went in and she's kind of standing there and she's directing us. And literally as we're walking around the home, she followed us. Every question that my clients asked, she didn't even let me answer the question. She answered the questions. So she was out of control. Yes. It was very uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable for me, and it was uncomfortable for my clients who are also Black. So when we left the property, because obviously they were not going to purchase that property, when we left, they had a few words that they shared with me, but I assured them that I would call that agent and follow up. And of course I did. And so I shared with her that we were uncomfortable. Number one, that there was no information in the showing instructions, nor in the agent-to-agent remarks that would indicate that she was going to be present at the property during our viewing. And I did not receive a phone call from her. So it's okay if it wasn't there, but if you were going to be there, there should have been some communication. And I just, suggested to her that in the future, she may want to change the way that she handles these particular types of situations. And I let her know too, that I was not pleased with the fact that she followed us and that she answered every question that my client had. And I reminded her that this was a showing and not an open house. And so we had a discussion, and she apologized. And I told her, I said, I don't even know that you're aware that this is how you made us feel, but I was not going to let the opportunity pass to share with you that you shouldn't do this to anyone else. And that literally was just within the last 2 weeks. Wow. I had a situation in Old Town East, and that was actually in Galena. I had a situation in Old Town East where the agent was supposed to arrive to let us into the house. It was still under renovation. And my client and I, we arrived there a little early. The door was open. We knocked on the door, kind of popped in. The contractor was there, and he's like, "Oh no, she's not here. She's usually late. Yeah, you guys can come on in." So we go in, we look at the house, we leave. We're sitting out in the on the street in the car, and we're talking about the house. I don't know when the agent showed up. She didn't show up, when we were there or anything. But several minutes later, the police pull up behind us. And one comes on each side of the car, and they're talking to me about what I'm doing there and blah, 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 just asking questions. They tell us, and I'm with my client. They're saying to me, well, yeah, you don't want to live in this neighborhood. And we're looking at a $435,000 house. You don't want to be in this neighborhood because we found a gun over there, and we found, just being very discouraging. So I get a call from the agent. I talk to the police, they leave. I get a call from the agent, and she's like, "Hey, are you guys here?" And I said, "Yeah, we've been in, we saw the house." I said, "But I want you to be aware that the police just showed up, and these were some of the things that they're saying." I said, "Hopefully they're not saying this to other people who are interested in this house," because my client was sitting in the car with me while this was being said. She's like, "Oh, that was you?" She called the police. She was the one who called the police. So because we were sitting outside. So I feel like, if you're uncomfortable working in a neighborhood, you probably shouldn't have a house listed there.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was probably about a year ago. I did just want to touch on a couple of other things, and these are things that people may, they say it's probably totally innocent, but it does speak to there being some bias. People will ask you if you're a part-time agent. The dreaded part-time agent. I think that there's a perception out there that many Black realtors work part-time, but there are actually many of us who work full-time. This is our career. This is what we do for a living. This is how we feed our families. I've had people make assumptions that I don't know anything about a particular neighborhood or a suburb, or they'll make assumptions about where I live or where I grew up, or they'll make assumptions about, whether or not I have children and how many. I mean, just really ridiculous things. And so it's just like you said, Buzz, this is an opportunity for people to hear, and there are things we do every day probably without thinking and not realizing how it may sound or impact another person. And I think one of the important things about what we're doing today is just if we can help people be more mindful and then change your behavior, because you're hurting people.
That's right.
If I haven't been asked 1,001 times if my client is using down payment assistance.
Oh my God.
If my client were using down payment assistance, I would have written it in there and let you know that they were using down payment assistance, so that's another stigma. And, Buzz, going back to the history of, generational wealth and FHA was a key contributor to us not getting the Black wealth that we had. I was on a call prior to this stating that only 2% of the original FHA loans that were given out were for Black people. Uh-huh. And they equated that back to those homes that they were purchasing at that time cost about $7,000. And if you only have to put 3% down on $7,000, and today those homes are worth $400,000 and $500,000, that's billions of dollars, of Black wealth. So it's just so much institutionalized with the down payment assistance. You can't even bring an offer with FHA now. It's such a stigma now to have FHA when I see appraisals from conventional getting, those are still getting conditioned now too. So it's this big stigma on FHA from before when it was redlining to our neighborhoods, but now I see, I'm not going to say lenders are steering, but in my opinion, when I tend to see a lot of my Black clients come to me, they are all FHA. And sometimes I have to push back and say, are they eligible for anything else? Because I feel like sometimes that's the first thing that's being offered to them. And as a first-time home buyer, you don't know what to ask for. And we need more Black real estate agents so that we can be those advocates to say, hey, is there anything else available that this client might be eligible for, versus just the first thing you're putting them in is an FHA. And then there's a stigma around that when it comes to the market that we're in, so that's a whole nother story about how, Black people are being disenfranchised with regards to trying to even purchase particular homes and the products that are being offered to them.
And even the appraisals, I think about some of the houses in Buzz's neck of the woods. It's interesting that a lot of the house, like Nationwide Children's, that Parsons Avenue, there's a lot of housing stock on the west side of Parsons that's very similar to the east side, but it's interesting that some folk have to fight for appraisal value because they're on the east side of Parsons Avenue.
Absolutely.
One of the things I sold for Children's Hospital, I remember I was on the front porch with the appraiser, and we were then well into doing renovative work. And it was a third-party company that had assigned this guy. This guy was out of Cleveland, and he's standing on the porch and he's looking around. He's going, well, this is the declining neighborhood. And I'm going, no, 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 no. Children's is investing $485 million in this. They're building a brand new state-of-the-art elementary school here. You know, we have several $1 million that has been allocated for this. And I mean, that guy, all he saw was this neighborhood and people of color. And I just want to touch on a couple things. One, attitude versus behavior. I don't really care what somebody's attitude is, but I do care how they treat me. And that's really important. I may not be able to change their attitude, but their behavior is really important. And one other thing that is a pet peeve of mine, and Katie knows this, language is so important. And all of us have heard this. And if we ever hear this one more time, we will cringe. Well, now, you know, some of my best friends are Black, you know, I mean, you get that part of it. But it's like, no, really, don't tell me that. Then you'll hear say, you know, I got a Black friend. Really? Now, do you have a Black friend or do you have a friend who is Black? And what's the operative word here? Is it color or is it the word friend that's here? And it's a subtle sort of thing that's as a part of our language. And people say it. And I don't know that they even think about it, but it does convey. It's why we have words. It's why we have orange and red. They mean different things. So, you know, speak the language, say what you actually mean. And I'm going to let this go, but before we go, I really would like Kiana to talk about the realtist, because I think that is very important in terms of the history, why it was even necessary.
Yes.
And that part of it.
Yes,
So,
that's for sure. Before we kind of move into that, I want Vanessa to speak on an experience, and then I think Newton, I'm not sure that you shared either, but also Buffy said something so poignant earlier, and it is about mindfulness. I mean, I'm learning so much from this call, just in the two examples, well, both of you, the examples that both Buffy and Kiana brought up, just in the most minute details that you're still experiencing, you know, biasness on the smallest scales, but they're like little jabs, like continued, you know, jabs that are happening. And I cannot imagine, to be honest, like what you have to fight through in terms of framework of who you are as a person, to not let that stuff get in to your soul and make you bitter and hard. So my heart goes out to you.
What I just like to add is when when we talk about this story with Jerry and the police, he had a showing after that. To that showing, he had to get himself together and say, you know what, this is another day. And he went to another showing after that, and he didn't talk to his son about it right away. He said, this is just another day in the hood, oh well. But it affected his son, you know what I'm saying? Yes. And so
yes,
that's when you have to really tackle it. But yeah, we call those microaggressions. You know, it's those small little jabs and things that happen where it may not be intentional, but it definitely is something that we catch on to, you know, and say, why did you say it like that? Or, you know, and those are the things that, you know, people will say, I don't see racism. I don't see where the racism is at, but it's those microaggressions that just keep jabbing that, you know, they don't even understand that they're doing stuff like that.
Yes, I'm so glad that has come up today. Okay, Vanessa, go ahead and share.
So there's just two things that I wanted to speak on. One was something that Buffy had said, and I really do feel that we have a lot of advocates, first of all. There are some good agents out there that, Newton spoke about Barbara, and I've had positive experiences with Mary Rattano, Carol Couch. I mean, that were just wonderful people that just were very giving of their time and energy, and always made me feel just like anyone else, just normal, not odd. But there are things that I would just ask of all of the realtor population out there, just be, again, mindful. Just be mindful of what you're saying. We're the gatekeepers. We're the ones that are guiding people home. We're taking people to neighborhoods. We've got to be more held to a higher standard, I think. We know better, and we should know better. We take fair housing. We understand that we should know better, and we should be expected to do better because we know better. And so I'm just going to caution everyone, you hear the name, I have a lot of agents in my office that are either people of color. They might have different sounding names. They have so many stories about people, making assumptions because of their names. Come on, guys, we are professionals. Be a professional, do better. You know better, we expect better.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, I'll just share real quick. I got several stories that I could theoretically share with the group, but the first thing I wanted to mention is, Katie, you talked about like, in your circle, sometimes, you'll have that conversation about white privilege. And, I would say, since everything that's been going on, I've had probably more conversations with people that were white than ever. And I would say it's super healthy. So, and I would encourage anybody out there, if you're kind of struggling with what's going on, find somebody that you trust and that you can talk to. And if you don't have a relationship with them, get to the point where you can have a relationship and talk open and candidly. Because I do believe that helps with understanding, especially when you're talking about the term white privilege, because, I think for a lot of white people, they look at that as such like a negative thing.
Mhm.
And but not understanding whether it's debatable whether it exists or not, but whether it does or doesn't. The one thing that if it does, that we got to know, you don't choose to get it. It's not like a disease or something. you know you you're born with it. So
Yeah.
so I think sometimes that's the struggle, that people look at it like, well, I don't have that disease. So but I do think having the conversation and creating understanding is really important. And something that's not been mentioned today, I like to talk about, just because, I think it's super important. When all of the protests broke out downtown, I have a son and daughter. I have a son, he's a senior at OSU, and a daughter, she's a junior at OSU. And we conversated that whole weekend. We spent the weekend talking. We would go to sleep talking. We would wake up talking, because they wanted to understand what was going on. For their generation, they never seen anything like this. And we talked about schools earlier. Well, they don't teach you about this, okay? And so we talked a lot about what was going on, and some of the stories in my life I shared with them. It was the first time I'd ever spoke so candidly to them. But when I hear about things like what happened to George Floyd, the first thing I think about are my children. My daughter is 19 and my son is 22. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I struggle because I have to have these conversations with them. And I never forget the first time that I had that talk with them about police officers and being pulled over, right before they started driving. And, for a lot of people, when I talk about the talk, they think, oh, you're talking about, your kids having sex or something like that. No, this is a talk that most Black people have with their children about being pulled over, by the police, and to obey the orders, put your hands on the steering wheel, and I always tell them, call me, put me on speaker as soon as it happens, let me know where you're at so I can get there. And, it's a shame that we have to have that conversation, but the reality is we all do. And that's because of the world that we live in. So, I think that that's story enough on my part, to explain that this is a real thing, that it happens. And, and I would encourage most people to look into their heart and just ask the question, do you have to have those sort of conversations? If you don't, then understand that, being a Black male or a Black person in this world, those are the sort of conversations that you have to have. And the last thing I like to share is something that I think the world struggles with. And it's the term progress and the term change. And I've heard it several times, and we have on the panel Vanessa, who's a manager with Coldwell Banker, and Buffy, I know she has her own office. And oftentimes people will say, well, it can't be that bad. Vanessa's a manager, Buffy, has her own office, but that's the difference between progress and change. So progress is the fact that Vanessa's a manager and Buffy has her own office. Change is when we can look across the world and we see Buffy's and Vanessa's everywhere, proportionate to this world of real estate. That's change. Progress is what we see right now. And I think sometimes we struggle with the two. We think that progress means that the world has changed. It doesn't. It just means that we've had progress. That's it. So.
I love that, what you just said, because when I talk about my son, I'm constantly worried about my son and my grandson. You talk about change, and there's so many people maybe older than you or people your age, they don't see any change at all. I've had conversations with folks recently, and they said, if we cover up the date, the things that are happening today are the same things they talked about in the Kerner Report of 1968.
Yes.
So what does change mean? I mean, the Kerner Report, if you guys recall, they talked about the same thing: police brutality, the criminal system, housing inequities. So in these conversations, how do you talk about productive change? I guess that's sort of a question and something that we have to get to. And I love what you said, change versus progress. But we've got to keep talking, but we have to do something more positive. Not sure what all that is. But as I said, the Kerner Report was written 50 years ago, and we're talking about the same things.
Speaking of that real quick, this is something, we had a panel at Coldwell Banker where we talked about the state and what was going on and creating understanding. And I highlighted something, I took a picture, and it was from, so I took this picture, and it was basketball players, popular basketball players, and they wore these t-shirts, and it said, "I can't breathe" on the t-shirt. And what I highlighted is most people would think that they were protesting George Floyd. But if you're a sports person, they're not even playing basketball right now. That was from 2014 when Eric Gardner was murdered by the police. Wow. And they wore the t-shirt, "I can't breathe." So progress would mean that George Floyd was alive because we corrected those police brutality issues. That would be change. If there was real change that happened from 2014 to today, we wouldn't be dealing with the same issues with police brutality. And the hardest thing I struggle with is these are people's lives. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we could go so deep and we could talk about incarceration and discrimination and things of that nature, but these are people's lives. I mean, people are dying. So when you see people protesting and, you could call it rioting, you can call it whatever you want. When you see those things happen, and someone else brought up to me, they said, the president of the United States had to go into a bunker because they were rioting at the White House. And he said, you don't think that that's a problem? I said, you know what, if I were the president and I had to go into a bunker, when I came out the bunker, probably the first thing I would say is there's something wrong. Yeah, let's solve that. Because at the end of the day, think about it. That's suicide to go in and try to take over the White House. That's suicide. But the reality is people are desperate enough to take those measures. So to me, it doesn't indicate, anything other than there's a big problem out there. So let's solve that.
That's right.
You know, one of the things I want to throw at is this. This was 1965. A book called Black Power was written by Stokely Carmichael and Charles B. Hamilton. And one of the things they said in there was the most powerful power in the world was the power to define. You can call up, down, left, right, black, or white. And the reason I say that is someone can be defined as a revolutionary, a protester, a rioter. And in the press, that frequently is whatever the negative connotation is, that's what we are called. And so I think that it is important to consider the words that we use particularly when we're defining a circumstance. What is a protester that is there? And protest is as American as the Boston Tea Party. Is in fact protected by the First Amendment. We have the right of redress. So the people that are out there doing that, I think that there's a distinction between the people who are protesting and those individuals who are engaging in behavior that's counterproductive. And then I thought about this. One of my closest friends is a guy named Don Kaiser. His father was an officer in the German army. He was a prisoner of war, and that's how he got here, okay? And so maybe there's that irony that's there. But Don literally has put his safety on the line to protect me when I was in the military from a beating that was planned on taking on me. Anyway, we were talking about the NBA, and I told him that when there was equality, when the NBA had an average talented black player on the bench, the way they have an average talented white player on the bench, then you would know. The stars are always going to be the stars, but you can see this even within sports. So there is, and the point I would make about that is this. I contend there is no element of your life as an African American that is not impacted by race, whether it's the Grove City Police following me when I'm in a sport coat, my car was washed, I was coming from my doctor's office, I'm driving down the street, I made the mistake of looking at the police officer as he passed me by. So he did a U-turn, and this has been about a year and a half ago, and he follows me through. So I decide I'm gonna see if this guy's really following me. So I turn right, and I turn left, and I turn right, and I turn left, and I turn right, and I turn left. And he followed me every one of those times to get until I finally got across the bridge to Home Depot. He didn't care that I was a Navy veteran, that I was instructor of the year with Columbus Realtors, that I'm a lay leader in my church, that I'm a grandfather, that I'm a father. He didn't care if I was a college graduate. And that's my point about this thing about education. I don't know so much is that it's important. Please don't get me wrong. That's one of the reasons I'm participating in this. It is important that people are educated, but there is a long history that we have to overcome. In the 1920s, there were over 21 million registered members of the Ku Klux Klan. If those people had children, and you count their children being adults, that means that they'd be in their 30s in the 1950s, and then in the 1980s. What happened to those people? What happened to the attitudes that they conveyed? They're still out there. And so as people of color, and again, I don't want to speak for everybody, you have to be careful when you're starting a relationship to protect yourself. And it is, I think it really speaks well for people of color when we are willing to risk a relationship, because we're the ones that stand to have our feelings hurt. To be asked by someone who had never talked to a Black person who was alive anyway, and had them say, as someone said to me, I have to ask you this question. My parents told me that Black people have tails. Is that really true? Yes, it did. It happened to me. And I said, I don't know. I'll tell you what, next time I take a shower, I'll check. Well, how do you even respond when somebody challenges your very humanity
Mm.
that's there. And those are the kinds of things, and you're right, it's a little jab and a little jab and a little jab. And it is one of the reasons that I think that people suddenly, I think in psychology, it's called the sock principle, where you stuff it and stuff it and stuff it, and then the sock explodes to do that. So anyway.
Yes, Buzz, thank you so much for sharing that. All right, so we'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Kiana. One of the topics we were going to talk about, and we can't get to all of this, but I think kind of just through conversation, we've gotten to most of this, but we'll kind of close out with this exclusion of people of color from NAR. And so we want Kiana to talk about the Ohio Realtors Association and NARAB as well.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Katie. Basically, the Columbus Realtors Association is a local chapter of the Ohio Realtors Association, which is a state chapter of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, which is the national organization, and it's the oldest Black trade organization in the country. Primarily just founded out of consumers and communities in America, just to give the opportunity for civil rights advocacy, for African-American real estate professionals to have a place to become developed. And the purpose of NARAB altogether was just to enhance the economic improvement of its members, the community at large, and the minority community, which we serve. So our organization, although, you know, it was born out of fair housing and of course, us not being included in NAR, ours is a little bit more holistic approach, a lot more community facing, and wanting to build generational wealth as well. So we don't strictly cater to the realtors or anything like that. We have lenders, and just to give you some history about the realtors so that you'll know how rich that is, we've been involved in legislative achievements, including the creation of HUD in 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, and also establishing affordable housing goals for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in 1992. So, and again, we're not just real estate agents. I mean, we have affiliate organizations as well with the National Society of Real Estate Appraisers, the Women's Council of NARAB, the Mortgage Banker Brokers Institute, the NARAB Investment Division, and we also have the State of Housing in Black America, just to name a few. So we're trying to do solutions. You know, we've been having this conversation for years now, since the beginning of whoever's time. So we're about solutions now, and that comes from research that we do with the State of Housing and Black America report, which we've been rolling out yearly now, that gives the numbers on what the state of housing in Black America is, essentially. And our current president, Donnell Williams, he's very active. He's come out with 8 initiatives, and we call it the NARAB 8. And just to give you a few, the main one we're focused on right now is the house in the car. Right now, we're trying to tap over 1 million millennials that are Black millennials that are making over 6 figures right now, and they're not purchasing homes. Even though we are seeing in the news that the home ownership rate with millennials is going up, it is not for Black millennials. And I mean, that's a holistic thing that we have to work with. I mean, we have to work on credit and things, but house in the car, essentially, and in my belief is that in the past, you know, for the lack of us having the opportunities to attain home ownership, that's just not something that's been in the sights for a lot of people. You know, that's just what they have been accustomed to. So when you have that kind of mentality, sometimes some people tend to wear their wealth. So you're making over 6 figures, you can afford a Range Rover, even though you're paying $800-900 a month for that. Because what we're finding now is that even though Black families average about $41,000 a year in earnings, which is 1/10 of white families. So of course, we're not going to be able to afford much. But those who do have the ability to afford it, they're getting denied at the same rates for loans, but because of affordability. And it's because of house payments, not even student loan payments anymore. It's because of car payments. So the house in the car is a huge, huge, huge initiative that we're trying to do to tap that millennial mindset so that they can start building that generational wealth, so that we can start trying to close that gap a little bit. We also have Rosie, which is real estate opportunities for seasoned individuals. And you would think seasoned individuals, 50, 60 years old. No, we're looking at people 40 and up, because the average age of a Black homeowner, a first-time homeowner, is about 48. We are way behind the ball on that. And as far as estate planning and things like that, we need to be talking about those things a lot earlier. So for us, Rosie, we say seasoned individuals. If you're 40 and up, you're seasoned. You've lived enough life to where you need to start making those plans and putting things in place. So we're definitely trying to get people to really have a holistic approach about it. And again, we've always been a faith-based organization, so we continue to go into the churches, and because a lot of civil rights, was founded, on the faith, the community, and religion. So we continue to strive with that, and also do civic engagement. So we have a number of national MOUs with the St. Jude's Hospital, Cancer Research. So we definitely work with all of those groups as well. We have a professional development, which is huge for us, because dealing with the communities that we're working with us being behind the ball and not having the incomes or the savings, of course, we are dealing with a lot of different down payment assistance and things like that as well. But don't get it twisted. All Black people are not broke. That's what I don't want people to think.
Right. Yeah.
We are not the budget organization, that just always strictly focus on our credit issues. We deal with doctors and lawyers and people that are investing, and developers as well. So we don't want people to think that when you think realtist or you think Black people, you're thinking, oh, this is just $100,000 house. You have Buffy showing $600,000 and $700,000 houses. So we have opportunities for everyone with NARAB.
When did the Realtors start? How old an organization is it?
The Realtors has been around since 1947. But what I'll tell you is they have record of local branches back to the 20s, coming off of Booker T. Washington having organizations prior to that. So the national organization itself started in 1947, but it has roots that goes back way before that as well with regards to organizing. And so what I want to talk about, and so this, you can go to columbusrealtors.com, houseinthecar.com for more information. And I tell you, if you become the membership, we have so much stuff coming down, because it's really about education, and we are having those conversations. We've been on Zoom calls with the Congressional Black Caucus and trying to get solutions from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac on how to make those changes in legislation, because we also need to work on legislation, but we also have people, we're working in the community as well. So right now, we're just still working on that home ownership, and we're really focused on keeping people in their houses right now, because the one thing we're focused on is that just keeping people in their homes increases home ownership. So many people lost their homes from the last crisis. Right now, we're going to just try to keep people in their homes right now and increase that with the millennials. But Buzz, you said something the other day that really kind of jarred me with regards to NAR, because we know that the first Black realtor in Columbus was 1970. But you made mention of two things that really piqued my interest with regards to, never has there been a national statement made from NAR regarding that. And then you also cited a policy that was in there back in the day that actually promoted discrimination, for them not to co-op with Black people or something like that. So I really wanted to go into that, because as of now, our organizations have not worked together. And clearly we know why, but as of recent years, we've started to open up that communication and that dialogue to try to educate everyone on what we're doing and how we can work together. So, we need to put it all out on the table there, but in recent years, we are trying to work together. I know they work on a national level, but I'd like to see us work more together on the local level.
Well, one of the things, and Marquet Bressler, we had a meeting, and she did research on this. And it was interesting because I know now, and everybody knows, we see NAR promoting equal opportunity. But the reality is, not only did they not do that, my experience personally of having blockbusting, my experience of having my family go out on Wyatt Avenue, a realtor show us a property, we're walking up to the house, and a guy opens the door and says, "Oh, no, 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 I'm not selling to colleagues," and slams the door in our face. And nothing came of that. But the research that Marquet did, NAR never had an official policy that says that minorities can become members. What they did is they said each individual board is allowed to make that decision for themselves. And so there was no formal declaration. You almost had to apply and see if you were accepted. And if you were accepted, then you could be a realtor that was there. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Cherie Smoot Johnson and Sarah Walsh. I wrote an article, and it's going to be coming in, and they need to be congratulated because it was Sarah's initiative, and it was Cherie's courage, because there were people on both sides of the aisle because of the long history of conflict between realtors and realtists. And they said enough was enough. They came together. We had a joint project celebrating the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Amendment. And out of that came a task force and then a committee. And those two people were leaders. Cherie is a past president of Columbus Realtors, and Sarah is a past president of Columbus Realtors. And the two of them, I hope that it comes down that their legacy is remembered as two people who not only talked about it, but they did something, and they did something active, and they provided a foundation for us to build on. So anyway, that's in talking to Kiana, I had mentioned that was part of the policy. One of the other things that had occurred is Sue Gleach, when she was president, I remember standing in the lobby of Columbus Realtors, and we had a display that celebrated, I don't know what anniversary it was of Columbus Realtors, and Sue said to me, asked me what I thought. And I said, "It's really nice, but it's not my history." And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, upstairs in that hallway of past presidents is the hallway of dead white people, because that's all that's up there. Okay, there's the white people that were head of this organization." And so I told her about some of the experiences that I had. And Sue, who has been a tremendous mentor and supporter to me, said, "I never thought about it." And I said to her, "You never had to. I'm not blaming you. You've never had to think about it to do that part of it." Barbara Locke and I have had this conversation, and she has been just absolutely amazed at some things. She has been a tremendous mentor of mine. And by the way, Saturday is Barbara Locke's birthday, okay? So you can send her a card.
Thank you,
I there's history that's there, and that history is important because we can choose. We can learn from it and decide that we're not going to repeat it, or we can keep our heads stuck in the sand. We can be part of denial. And so anyway, and lastly, I want to do this. I want to thank Katie. There are a lot of places out there that people had platforms that they could have said, in somewhat taking a risk and saying, "I want to make a difference. I want to help. I want to educate. I want to be a part of it." So any of you that don't know Real Producers Magazine, I'm going to encourage you to get a copy, to read about it, and ask them for a back copy of the one that has Newton Burris's picture in it. Because I'm telling you, that photograph, that photograph will be in a museum. It was absolutely great. And so people get featured that are there. So put your advertising dollars in something, do Real Producers Magazine. And Katie, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Brent Swander said this to me one time. He said, Buzz, you only have two choices. You either get a seat at the table or you become an item on the menu. And we don't always get a seat at the table. And what you have done, Katie, is to provide a place for us to have a seat at the table. And so I love you and thank you so much.
And I love you. And thank you, Buzz. It's my honor. It's my privilege. I've learned a lot today, and I just want to thank you, each and every one of you, for spending this time with us. You're helping to impact a community by having this conversation today. Do any of you have organizations to suggest, apart from becoming part of Realtist, that you can help so change can happen? Do any of you have feedback in terms of how others can get involved or how we can continue to educate ourselves?
I want to put in a quick plug for the Columbus Realtors. Honestly, I mean, we need more diversity there. So all of you Black and brown folks out there, please come join us, unite so that we can, help change things. That's where change can occur for our organization, is with you getting involved. So that's my plug for Columbus Realtors.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, Vanessa. I'm so glad that you said that. I have been in this real estate community for about 9 years now, and I will say that is where the change happens, in small circles. So if you don't go to, in pockets of the city, you can go to a Realtor Association meeting weekly. Take the time to get involved, because relationships happen and ripples happen from relationships. And there are so many committees that you can get involved at Columbus Realtors. Vanessa, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. We are covering committees in our publication every month just to bring awareness, to get involved. And that's where growth and change happens. So anyone else want to mention anything in regards to that?
Well, I would point this out. The question that I had somebody ask me several years ago was, why are always the same people? Why are there pictures in the In Contract magazine? The reason is they are people who show up.
Yes.
Columbus Realtors is not your father's organization. It is open, it is welcoming, and I think that if you choose to, you can whine and complain, or you can join a committee and make a difference that's there. I was fortunate enough to serve on the board of directors. Buffy is now, Newton is, I think, still, which is a real change in a fairly short period of time, even though there's only a small number. I think it's an indication of the way that the organization is going. You can make a difference if you join a committee.
Excellent.
Oh, I would say one other thing, and I know that Buffy has talked about, well, actually, I think we were on an email chain. One of the other things I think that we can do, and I think that we must do, there's the idea of going to the mountain or bringing the mountain to Mohammed. And so people, and there's so many mother, son, father, son, families that get involved in real estate because there's a history of it out there. There's so few of us that serve as examples, living examples. I would like to see us actually form teams of 2 or 3 or whatever and go to career days where high school students are there. Not everyone is going to go to college. And I think that talking about this as a viable opportunity to make a living and to talk about the benefits, I'd also talk about the downsides, because essentially when you start a real estate business, you are starting your own business. And so I think it's up to us to, rather than say, gee, I hope that more people apply for scholarships. I'm on the scholarship committee. We don't always give away all the money that's there. And there are very few minorities actually that apply. So I think being proactive and going out to the community and saying, hey, come join us. Let me tell you a little bit about what it's like to be a realtor. Thank you.
So
I did
Excellent
I did
idea.
have one thing. And Buzz, to that point, there's actually an organization that employs young people for internships, and they actually pay those young people. I have two 21-year-olds that are interns in my office right now. They're able to work up to 480 hours, and they are learning about a career in real estate. They chose not to pursue college as an opportunity, although they may in the future, because the youngest of the two just asked me, how do you become a broker? So, we had that conversation. We talked about the fact that you are going to have to, attend college at some point if that is a career path. But what I wanted to say was that hopefully this conversation today has opened up an opportunity for people to know and to understand that they can actually reach out. So I hope this goes beyond just this, this 2 hours that we've been here today, and that people can reach out and like have an open and honest dialogue. I would say probably with any one of us, and even beyond us, in an environment that's safe. So you can ask your questions. We're going to answer your questions. We're going to talk to you about perhaps some perceptions or misperceptions that you have, and I think that helps people get to a place where they understand and maybe can bring some change. You can talk to us like we're safe. So
Buffy, thank you so much. That's awesome offering. Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Excellent.
So Katie, what do you think? Do you think that we'll do something like this again in the future, or how can people provide questions or feedback that perhaps we could use to maybe address some issues that have not been addressed during this particular session?
That's excellent. Well, I think if folks would like to comment about future topics to discuss on a call, I do want to continue this conversation. Just one conversation, it's impactful, but I think it's a dialogue that needs to continue. We will be covering this particular call in our September issue, highlighting this conversation to get it out to even more people, to continue to help further understanding. So yeah, if people would like to comment below, and we will make available kind of contact information for everybody. I mean, you are a real estate agent, so all you have to do is Google these folks pretty much, but we'll make it easy for you. That's a great question, Buzz. So, all right. Well, any other closing comments? Otherwise, we will close out this discussion today, but it will be to be continued.
Is there a link that this is being recorded that somebody could come back and see this conversation at a later time?
What's lovely about Facebook is it's live right now, but it will continue to be. Now you can just go to our Real Producers page and look at videos, and it will be there. It will save automatically, but I am recording it on my computer. So if someone would like to share this with an office in terms of an educational piece, I can get that to you, and I'll put my email below as well.
Okay. All
Thank
right.
you.
Katie.
Thank you all so
Katie.
much.
Katie.
Thank you
so much.
so much.
it was awesome.
Thank you. My honor.
Perfect. Perfect opportunity.
Bye.
Bye, Buzz.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye. See you.